The Wyoming wind had teeth that November. It cut through wool and bone and pride alike, and it cared nothing for the carefully laid plans of men, or for the quiet desperation of a woman moving west with nowhere left to go. The sky above the Laramie foothills had turned the color of a bruise by mid-afternoon, purple and gray and swollen with the kind of cold that settles into old wood and never fully leaves. In a valley most maps didn't bother naming, a single ranch sat against the treeline like something the land had forgotten to swallow. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin, reluctant thread, the only sign that anyone inside was still trying. Ezra Cole had not spoken to another living soul in 14 days. Not since the morning he stood beside a fresh mound of earth beneath the cottonwood tree at the far edge of his property and said goodbye to the only person who had ever made this land feel like more than a burden. Margaret had been 34 years old. She had died of a fever that took her in 4 days, fast enough that Ezra still could not entirely believe it had happened. He moved through his days the way a man moves through deep water, slowly, against resistance, doing the necessary things, feeding the horses, splitting wood, boiling coffee he rarely finished because stopping felt dangerous. A man who stops moving in grief, he had learned, may never start again. He was 41 years old. He felt 90. He found her on the 3rd morning of December. He had gone to the barn before dawn to check on the mare who had been favoring her left foreleg, lantern swinging in his hand, boots crunching across frozen ground. He pushed open the heavy barn door and stopped. The smell reached him first. Not the familiar combination of horse and hay and cold wood, but something else underneath it. Soap, faint and floral, from another life. He raised the lantern. She was in the far corner, behind the tallest stack of hay bales, curled against the wall with a wool blanket that was not his pulled tight around her shoulders. She was awake. She had been awake, he realized, for some time. She was watching him with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that sudden movement cost more than it was worth. Her dress was the dark blue of a schoolteacher, practical, well-made once, now torn at the hem and stained with mud along the skirt. Her shoes had been removed and set beside her with precise care. The leather cracked along the soles, strips of cloth wrapped around her feet in their place. She was perhaps 28. Her eyes were dark and steady and did not look like the eyes of someone who planned to beg. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The mare shifted in her stall. Wind pushed against the barn walls with a low, steady moan. The woman did not look away from him. She did not shrink back or lower her eyes or offer the automatic apology that fear usually pulls from people in unexpected places. She simply looked at him, and he had the strange feeling he was being assessed as carefully as he was assessing her. "I'm not a thief," she said at last. Her voice was composed, educated clearly, precise in the way of someone who had spent years teaching children to speak correctly and had applied the same discipline to herself. "I have used some of your hay and a little of your water from the trough. I intend to pay for both." Ezra looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her feet, then back at her face. "Can you walk?" he asked. Something flickered in her expression. Not quite surprise, something closer to recognition. As though she had expected anger and had received instead something she didn't know how to immediately categorize. "Yes," she said. "Then come inside," he said, "before you lose those toes altogether." He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting to see if she followed. She followed. Inside his kitchen, she sat at his table and he boiled water and did not ask questions. He set bread and cold beans in front of her and she ate without hurrying, which told him she had some experience in managing hunger, eating slowly when the body wanted to rush to make the food last, to avoid the sickness that comes from eating too fast after too little. When she had finished, she folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "My name is Clara Marsh," she said. "I taught school in Laramie for 3 years." She paused. The new school board decided a married woman would be more appropriate for the post. Ezra poured 2 cups of coffee and set one near her without comment. "They let me go in October," she continued. 2 weeks' wages. A letter of recommendation that was more insult than reference. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth of it seemed to reach something in her. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, her jaw unclenched slightly. "I had a cousin in Salt Lake City." I wrote to her 3 weeks ago. A brief pause. She has not written back. Ezra drank his coffee. The stove crackled. Outside, the first pale winter light was beginning to color the frosted window glass. He said nothing, but he did not leave the table either. She worked. That was the first thing he understood about her, clearly and without ambiguity. She did not wait to be shown. On the first morning, while he was seeing to the horses, she had washed every dish in the basin, swept the kitchen floor, and laid a fire in the front room hearth that had not been lit since Margaret died. On the second day, she mended a shirt he had set aside months ago and never looked at again. On the third, she found his extra candles and replaced the burned-down stubs throughout the house without comment. She learned the rhythm of his days without asking. When he came in, when he went out, when he wanted silence, and when he might be capable of brief conversation. She did not push. She did not fill the quiet with noise. She simply occupied the house alongside him with a careful respect that he found, to his own surprise, easier to live with than the emptiness had been. On the sixth evening, she asked if she could plant something in the kitchen window box, herbs if he had any seeds. It was December. The ground was frozen. He had not planted anything since the spring Margaret got sick. He looked at her for a moment. "Seeds are in the cellar," he said. "Bottom shelf, left side." Standing at the window that night, watching her candle glow move in the cellar stairway, Ezra Cole felt something in his chest he did not yet have a name for. Something small. Something that had not been there the week before. On the eighth night, he found the letter. It slipped from the inner lining of her coat and fell to the floor at his feet. He would have left it, would have simply placed it back without reading, the way a decent man should. But the name on the outside stopped him. It was not addressed to Clara Marsh. It was addressed to Clara Ashford, care of the District Court, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. Attention, Judge Warren Hale. Personal and confidential. Urgent. He stood there in the doorway for a long time. The name Ashford meant something to him. Not the woman. He had never heard of any Clara Ashford. But the name itself. He had heard it in town, in lowered voices, in the particular tone men used when they were speaking about someone they were afraid to speak about openly. Senator Douglas Ashford. The most powerful man in Wyoming Territory. Known for building railroads and buying judges and making problems quietly disappear. Ezra looked at the letter in his hand. Then he looked at the door to the spare room, closed, a thread of candlelight at the bottom. He placed the letter on the table and sat down in the dark and waited. She came out when she heard him sit down. She stood in the doorway of the spare room looking at the letter on the table between them, and something in her face changed, not into panic, but into resolution. The expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told they can set it down, whether they wanted to or not. She sat across from him. She did not reach for the letter. "Clara Ashford," he said. Not a question. She nodded once. "Douglas Ashford's daughter?" "His niece," she said. "His brother's daughter. I lived in his house from the time I was 12 until I was 22. She looked at the table. "I saw things in that house, over many years. Things that were done to people who had no power to stop them. I wrote it all down. Names, dates, specific events. 12 pages. She looked up at him. "He found out I was doing it 6 weeks ago. 2 of his men came to my school." Her hands were very still on the table. "I ran," she said simply. "I have been running since then." Ezra looked at her across the candlelight for a long moment. The fire had burned low. Snow had begun again outside, tapping softly at the glass. "Does he know you came this way?" he asked. "He will," she said. "He always finds things out eventually. It's the one thing he's genuinely good at." The riders came on a Thursday, 11 days after she had arrived. 3 of them, approaching from the south road in the early afternoon. Well-dressed for ranch country, which meant they were not ranchers. Dark coats, good horses, the kind of men who moved through the world as though it had been arranged specifically for their convenience. Ezra was mending fence along the north pasture when he saw them coming, and he walked to the gate and waited. The one in front had a pleasant face and empty eyes. He asked about a young woman, dark-haired, traveling alone. He said she was a relation of a prominent family and that the family was concerned for her welfare. He smiled when he said it. The smile of a man who is confident you will not cause him any difficulty. Ezra looked at him for a long moment. "Haven't seen a soul come through here in 3 weeks," he said. "It's been a hard season for travel." The man held his gaze a second longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded slowly. "Much obliged," he said. They turned their horses and rode back south. Ezra watched them until they disappeared around the tree line. Then he walked to the house and told Clara to pack only what she could carry. They were leaving at midnight. They rode through the night. 2 horses, packed light, moving north along the creek bed where the ground was frozen hard enough to leave no tracks. Clara rode without complaint. He had expected questions or fear or protest and received none of these. She rode with her chin level and her eyes forward and matched his pace without being asked. Around 3 in the morning they stopped in a stand of pines to rest the horses, and he built a very small fire against the cold, and she produced 2 biscuits from her coat pocket that she had baked that afternoon without telling him why, and he understood then that she had been preparing to run again long before he told her to. They sat by the small fire without speaking for a while. The stars were very clear and very cold. Somewhere to the north an owl called twice and went silent. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. Her voice was quiet, not accusing, genuinely asking. Ezra looked at the fire for a moment. "My wife had a saying," he said. "A person in trouble is just a person who needs someone to be decent." Clara was quiet. "She sounds like she was worth grieving," she said at last. He did not answer for a while. The fire settled. The horses shifted. The pine branches above them held their cold blue silence. "Yes," he said at last. "She was." They reached the town of Rawlins 2 days later, half frozen and saddle-sore. Ezra had a contact there, a man named Aldous Fitch who asked fewer questions than most people considered healthy. Aldous took one look at them and asked no questions at all. He gave Clara a room above the freight office and fed them both hot soup from a pot that seemed to be permanently on his stove. Clara mailed the letter to Judge Hale from the Rawlins post office the following morning. Registered, witnessed, a full copy made by the postmaster and sealed in a second envelope sent to a lawyer in Denver whose address she had memorized and never written down. When she came back, she sat at Aldous's kitchen table and was very quiet for a long time. Ezra brought her coffee and sat across from her and said nothing. After a while she looked up. Her eyes were dry. Her expression was the particular kind of still that comes not from the absence of feeling but from feeling so many things at once that none of them can move. "It's done," she said. "Whatever happens now, I can't undo that. I don't want to." The weeks that followed were the strangest of Ezra Cole's life. They waited in Rawlins while word moved slowly through the channels that word moved through in 1883, by letter, by writer, by the careful whisper network of people who had reason to want Douglas Ashford held accountable. There was nothing to do but wait, and in the waiting something happened that neither of them had anticipated and neither of them spoke about directly. They began, cautiously and without ceremony, to know each other. Clara taught Aldous's 2 youngest children their letters in the morning because she could not tolerate idleness for long. Ezra helped repair the freight wagon because his hands needed the work. In the afternoons they sometimes sat together and Clara read aloud from the one book Aldous owned, a battered collection of English poetry, and he listened without pretending he wasn't listening. "You don't have to sit here," she told him once, not unkindly. "I know," he said, and stayed. The danger came back on a Monday. One of Ashford's men had been asking questions across 4 towns and had eventually asked the right question to the wrong person in Rawlins. Aldous came upstairs at 7 in the morning with a look on his face that required no explanation. "He's at the saloon," he said, "asking about a schoolteacher and a rancher traveling together." Ezra was already pulling on his boots. They rode north for 2 days into country so empty it felt like the world had simply stopped being finished. Mountains on 3 sides, frozen creek beds, sky the color of pewter from horizon to horizon. On the second afternoon the temperature dropped sharply and Ezra made the decision to shelter in a line cabin he knew from his father's time. Barely more than 4 walls and a stove, used by cattle drivers in summer and abandoned all winter. The stove still worked. There was dry wood stacked against the wall. That night, wind hammered the cabin walls with a sound like a living thing trying to get in, and they sat on either side of the small stove with their boots off and their feet toward the warmth, and the storm outside made the cabin feel, despite everything, like shelter. "Tell me something about her," Clara said at some point in the night. "Margaret." Ezra was quiet for a long time. "She laughed at things I never expected," he said finally. "Completely ordinary things. The way a hen moves. The sound a gate makes in wind. I spent 10 years trying to guess what would make her laugh, and I never did." Clara was quiet. "That's a good kind of person to be married to," she said softly. Ezra looked at the fire. "Yes," he said. "It was." They reached Cheyenne on the 12th day. Clara had memorized Judge Hale's private address as well as his courthouse office, and she went to the residence first at 7 in the morning, and Ezra stood at the garden gate and watched her walk up the path with her spine straight and her chin level and knock 3 times with the brass knocker as though she were expected. She was inside for 2 hours. When she came out, she walked back down the path and stood beside him on the street, and the look on her face was one he had not seen before. Not relief exactly, but something underneath relief. Something more fundamental. The expression of a person who has put down something so heavy for so long that the body doesn't quite know what to do with its own emptiness. "He'll convene a hearing," she said. "He already has 2 other complaints against Douglas that he couldn't move on alone. Mine gives him what he needs." She looked down the street for a moment. "It will take months, possibly a year, but it will happen." They stood on the Cheyenne street in the cold morning air, 2 people who had ridden 12 days through winter country together and who were now standing in a city with nowhere in particular they urgently needed to be. It was, Ezra realized, a strange and not entirely unpleasant feeling. They stayed in Cheyenne for 3 days while Clara gave her formal deposition. On the last evening, they walked along the main street after supper, not for any purpose, simply walking, and Clara stopped in front of a shop window where spring seed catalogs had already been arranged, bright and hopeful against the winter street. She looked at them for a long moment. "I don't know what I do now," she said, not distressed, genuinely and quietly puzzling it out. "I don't have a post. I don't have a direction." She turned and looked at him. The shop window light fell warm across her face against the cold street. "What do you do?" she said carefully. "When the thing you were running toward is finished?" Ezra looked at the seed catalogs in the window. He thought about a kitchen window box, and herb seedlings started in December, and small green shoots coming up against all reason in the middle of the worst winter in years. He thought about an empty house and a cottonwood tree and 14 days of silence, and the particular morning he pushed open a barn door and found something unexpected in the dark. "I expect," he said slowly, "you figure out where you want to plant something." He looked at her. "And you go there." They rode south and west out of Cheyenne on a bright cold morning in January, back through the country they had crossed going north, and it looked different in both directions, not because the land had changed but because they had. They talked more on the return. Not about the danger which was behind them now, but about ordinary things. What she had studied at the teacher's college in Cincinnati. The names he had given all his horses and the logic behind the naming, which she found funnier than he expected. Whether herb seedlings started in December could survive to spring in a kitchen window box in Wyoming. He thought they could. She said she intended to find out. The ranch looked different when they rode in from the north. It always did. The same property looked like a different place depending on the direction you arrived from and the state you were in when you arrived. The cottonwood tree by the far fence was bare and silver in the January light. The house looked small and solid and patient, the way houses look when they have been waiting. The herb seedlings in the kitchen window box had survived. Clara checked them first before she removed her coat, before she did anything else. She stood at the window for a long moment looking at the small green shoots in the cold light, and he watched her face do something he had not seen it do in all the weeks he had known her. She simply looked happy. Not the carefully managed composure she had worn as armor. Not the focused determination she had used as a tool. Simply happy, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has planted something and returned to find it still alive. It was, Ezra Cole thought from the doorway, a very good thing to be able to make someone feel. It was also the first time in more than 2 months that he had thought about the future. Spring came slowly to that valley, the way spring always came to high country. grudgingly in installments, taking back warmth for days at a time before finally allowing it to stay. But it came. February gave way to a March that was still cold but smelled different. The ground softened. Clara's herbs moved from the window box to a bed she dug along the south side of the house where the wall held warmth. She planted other things, practical things, useful things, and also flowers, small and persistent, pushing up along the porch rail in colors that had no particular purpose except to be seen. Ezra mended the north fence, repaired the barn roof, did the 100 deferred tasks of a man who has decided that the property he lives on is worth the effort of maintaining. On an evening in late April, she came to stand beside him at the fence where he was watching the last of the sunset turn the sky over the mountains amber and rose. She stood close enough that their arms touched. Neither of them moved away. "I got a letter from the judge's clerk today," she said. "The hearing is set for September." Ezra nodded. "Douglas Ashford has already retained 4 lawyers," she said. "The clerk says that's usually what guilty men do." The sky deepened. The first stars appeared. Neither of them moved. "What do you want to do?" Ezra said. "In September?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "I want to testify," she said. "And then I want to come back." She did not look at him. She did not need to. "Here," she said simply. Clara Ashford testified in Cheyenne that September. She stood in the district courtroom for 4 hours and answered every question put to her with the steady precision of a woman who had spent 12 years remembering things carefully so that one day she could say them out loud in a room where they would matter. Douglas Ashford was convicted on 3 counts in November. He spent the remaining years of his life considerably less powerful than he had begun them. Clara came back to the valley on the 1st of December, almost exactly 1 year after a rancher had pushed open a barn door at dawn and found her watching him from behind the hay bales. She rode in from the north road with a single bag and a small crate of books and the composed expression she wore when she was pretending to be less moved by something than she actually was. Ezra was waiting at the gate. He had been there a while. He did not say anything when she rode up. She looked down at him from the saddle for a moment. Then she swung down and he took the reins, and for a moment they simply stood in the December light. The cold air between them, the ranch behind him, a year of everything they had been through hanging in the air like weather. Then she reached into the crate and showed him a small tin containing 3 tiny green shoots wrapped in damp cloth. He looked at them. He looked at her. "Kitchen window?" he said. She smiled, the full kind, the kind that reached her eyes and stayed there. "Kitchen window," she said. And they walked together through the gate toward the house where the lamplight was already burning warm against the December dark. 2 people who had found each other at the wrong time in the wrong storm in the wrong barn, and who had, against all reasonable expectation, managed to build from those ingredients something that felt, finally and completely, like home.